Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. At long last, it is time to tackle painting the Avatar of Khaine. It's a gorgeous looking model and I'm super intimidated by it. It's kind of a monstrous job. I don't know if I'll be able to do a decent job of it, but let's take my quick painting techniques, apply them to this model, and cross our fingers and hope that I can do a decent job. Have you painted yours yet? If not, how about some ideas? Here he is, the Avatar of Khaine. It's a gorgeous looking model. I love it. It is so cool. It's got a zenithal prime, so dark on the underside, bright on the top side, because I want to make this dark menacing model, which is weird, right? Because he's got this whole molten metal thing going for him. How is molten metal dark? I don't know. I haven't worked through that out yet, but I'm going to give it a shot. And so we've got our guy here, and this one happens to be fully magnetized, fully in that you can replace the heads with his other two heads when they cooperate, like that. And you can also replace the weapons, so he can be holding the sword, or he can be holding this awesome lance. Here, let me switch over that thing right there. So you have three different flavors of the Avatar. They all look menacing. They all look cool. And I'm going to try to make this model justice. Now, before I talk about the plan for the painting of this model, I do want to do a couple of comparisons, because this is a big boy. Now, this may not be kind of a revelation to any of you who have been with the hobby for a while, but for me, I've been with this hobby for about a little over a year, having returned since my original kind of experience with Warhammer 40k back in 1999. So to me, this Avatar looks ginormous. So just for scale, here is a modern Aeldar Guardian. This guy is like 4 of these, maybe, in height. So this guy is like 4 times the height of this guy. But that isn't the craziest thing, although that is pretty crazy. I can't imagine being this guy on the battlefield and seeing that thing lumber past. But look at this guy. This is my original Avatar from 2nd edition. He was a big bad mamma jamma back in his day, and he is, well, yeah, he's more than half the height of the new Avatar, which is cool. But it's still a pretty significant difference in just size and scale and all that kind of good stuff. The basic ideas are still there. So we've got the bloody-handed gauntlet, we have the Wailing Doom, we have this interesting helmet thing happening. So a lot of the ideas for the modern model were around even back in 2nd edition, but things have changed in scale, man. And I, for one, am here for it. Here, in fact, we'll just add this Aeldar Guardian next to the original Avatar of Khaine. And so this guy's about twice the height of this guy. Yeah, this is a pretty neat to see the change in kind of the design aesthetics and the things that we kind of take for granted now as Warhammer 40k collectors in the modern age. Let's talk about the plan. What is the plan for this model? Well, molten metal wherever I can, which means very light yellows and maybe some reds in the crevices, but in kind of towards the surface, I want to get kind of a darker, maybe not quite black, but kind of like a metal is cooling feeling. That's kind of, I think, what I want to go for. And so then the armor plates would also end up being black, I think, which I'm less happy about. So maybe what I really need to do is on the skin areas, those will be kind of black, right? That'll be the molten iron. The bits of armor that are, I guess, kind of provided by the craft world, I can make those yellow. Yellow is the color of my craft world. Iliandin, I think, is how it's pronounced. So we can go with yellow here, although I'm afraid it's going to contrast a bit with the flame effects, but I'll figure something out. There'll be different colors of yellow. The tabard here, I don't know. I really don't know how I'm going to approach this model, but I do know I want to go with like kind of a metallic feeling. Man, this is going to be hard. I think I'm going to keep yellow as my accent color. So yellow on the tabard, yellow on some details of the kind of formal plates, maybe like a dark metal thing happening for his skin, like a dull black. And then the details I'll sprinkle in blue and yellow, kind of where I think it works. This is going to take some doing. I am deathly afraid I'm not going to be able to do this thing justice. And to boot, I have extra parts to also paint before this is all done, because I chose to magnetize this guy. All right, that was the plan. Let's start with the base coat glaze. I really hemmed and hawed about the primary color, the color that's going to be the avatar's, essentially his body. And in fact, I did quite a bit of hemming and hawing about the rest of the base coat as well. I kept thinking, man, I need to do blending here. I need to do some shading there. And in spite of the fact that I'm not good at those at all, I thought, man, I need to start practicing on these. And this is the model to do it on. And it's not. It's a fantastic model. It deserves deserves me at my best, not me experimenting on it. And so I also then thought of the whole purpose of the channel, right, was to think about showing people that you can do really nice paint jobs without a bunch of these, more advanced techniques. So I buckled down and said, no, we're going to use the usual quick painting stuff. So that's what I've done here. For the primary color, I went ahead and stuck with Uniform Gray from Army Painter. It's kind of a medium gray. My idea here is that I want some grayness, but I want it to kind of approach black, but not get too black the way my kind of black recipe tends to do. So I want a little bit of that ashiness to stick around. So I went with this color for all of those body parts. For the rest of the base coat, I went with a couple of colors. So I wanted to make sure that my craft world was represented, and so the primary colors of my craft world are yellow and blue. And so I wanted to make sure that there was a decent amount of yellow and blue on this model. And so I went with the yellow that I've chosen for my craft world, Desert Yellow by Army Painter. I used a light to medium glaze of this over some of the armor components. So some of the armor components are yellow, some of the other armor components are deep blue. This is the blue that I'm using as a secondary color for my craft world. And so I added these to different armor elements and also to the tabard element kind of at the front of this model. Now, one of the things that I've learned in the past is that when I use base coat glazing, my colors tend to be fairly unsaturated, and so I decided to try a little bit of a modification. So once the first layer of the light to medium base coat glaze went on, I added a second layer of that very same glaze, be it yellow or blue. But I added that only on those areas where highlights would be present. So kind of on the tops of armor panels, anything that was kind of facing downwards or would be in shadow, I let that stay desaturated in the hopes of kind of creating additional contrast between my areas of shadow and my midtones, and eventually the highlights. I don't know yet how that worked out, but we'll find out as we get closer to the end of this project. Some additional colors that I used for the hafts of weapons. I went with a really dark brown, a very light glaze of this oak brown. And for any metallic elements, I went with matte black. I wanted something very dark so that as I add the metallic elements over that, it would be nice and reflective. It's a quality I don't get as much of when I use kind of the gray, the dark gray undercoat, so I want to push up the shine just a little bit. The base coating is complete, and he's looking kind of weird. There's a lot of yellow and blue on him, more than I kind of expected, but that's okay. We can fix it in post. Wait, I'm post. Never mind. So we've got the yellows, we've got the blues, we've got the grays. So it looks a little weird. It looks a little stark, and I'm like 85% sure that this very next step will start making this make more visual sense. And so this next step is for the washing step. I had to really think about what it was that I wanted to accomplish, because I have a couple of tools that'll do a similar job, but in a slightly different way. And I've been telling myself that it matters, and I wanted to kind of put it to the test. And I think that my experience here really kind of solidified that for me. So I have a couple of things to wash. I have the main body of the Avatar, and so right now that's kind of a medium gray, and I wanted to really darken that up, and so I used Army Painter's Dark Tone. This is a dark wash. It's basically like, think of it as a dark ink, but with some kind of something in the fluid that makes it kind of viscous, and it really does darken up the shade that goes in there. So it doesn't just accumulate in the cracks, it darkens up the surface of the paint that you're laying it over by a much greater degree than a counterpart like Citadel Colors Nuln Oil. So I've used this because I wanted to darken up the Avatar's body, and it worked pretty well. Although, as I'm looking at the model, I think probably another coat of this would help me out, because I do want to make it a little bit darker. I use this very same wash on the blue components of the Avatar's armor. The idea here is I want to darken up the armor so that I can, establish some really nice shadows, but it also gives me the opportunity to kind of introduce some highlights and maybe reintroduce the mid-tone, and so it helps to have kind of a dark baseline to start with, but sometimes you want something a bit more delicate, and so you use another product, but Army Painter Dark Tone did it for me for those two pieces. To do something similar with the yellows, this time I used Mid Brown by Army Painter. This is a nice, kind of a dark, warm brown wash. Now, in both these cases, though, when I've used the Army Painter washes, I did add a little bit of Flow Improver. This helps kind of thin it down a little bit, these army painter washes tend to be a little on the viscous side, and sometimes that's what you want, but it could also lead to kind of a sticky, gloopy, spotty mess. So, you know, use your experience with it, but for me it helped. It kind of made it less viscous and made it a more even layer. And so I added this color, this shade, to any of the yellow pieces of armor, and it gives it that yellow a very nice brown that I can kind of reintroduce later on in other steps. Having said that, I did in fact use Nuln Oil as well, but not on the body of the model. I used Nuln Oil for the kind of the loincloth element on the front of the Avatar's model. I repainted this white, and I wanted a delicate wash to kind of introduce those shadows. That did the job better than I think the dark tone would have done. So the washing is done, so let's take stock of our angry little friend here. And I gotta say, he looks pretty darn good. Just the combination of the Basecoat Glaze and the washes have really helped the details that are already molded onto this model. They pop. You can see them, and really, if you were just interested in speed painting, this is kind of where you would stop. I mean, you would add some details, right? A couple of gems, the eyes, certainly the flames, etc., etc. But you'd be basically close to done, and you'd have a tabletop-ready model that looks pretty good. But that's not what we're going to do today. I want to add some more. Basically, I want to keep working on the kind of the basic elements of the model before I go on to detailing, and that involves a couple of different steps. It's going to involve a little bit of dry brushing, maybe a little bit of blending, or a little bit of glazing actually, because I want the yellows to stand out a bit, so I'm going to use some dry brushing to do that. Same thing with the blues. I want some of those to show up as lighter blue, right? To show up as highlights. Same thing with the yellows here. I got the beginnings of that highlight, so you can kind of see that most clearly here on the shin armor. You can see how there's a bit of yellow up top that's brighter than the bottom. Kind of that's where light hits it. And same thing here. This part of the shin of the leg is noticeably more yellow than this interior side. That interior side is a bit in shadow, so it would be a little darker. And so we want to kind of enhance that a bit. So this is the part where we can deviate. If you're just interested in just a simple tabletop ready model, you know, speed paint, then this is where you go. You'd skip over to the details section and you'd be done. But if you want to spruce it up a bit, the quick paint, right, which is speed paint plus, then we're going to spend a little bit more time making this a little nicer before we move on to the detail stage. For the dry brushing stage, it was interesting. I kind of tried a little harder than I usually do, and I think I like the results. So generally speaking, the way I did this is I went over let's say the yellow piece, right? The yellow pieces. I went over, I dry brushed the original color that I had laid down as a base coat glaze. So for the yellow, I used the desert yellow. For the blue, I used the deep blue. And for the hair, I used mummy robes for the base coat glaze, which is kind of an off-white. And so after I added the washes, it went considerably darker. So by adding kind of a fresh layer of the dry brush over that existing kind of base coat and wash combination, it kind of brought back some of the original color, but only in those areas that I dry brushed. So I focused my dry brushing almost exclusively on those parts of the model that are facing kind of up and out. So any place where there would be some direct sunlight or kind of the ambient lighting would be hitting it, that got the dry brush. For the kind of inside or kind of below stuff, I almost didn't touch it at all with a dry brush. Sometimes if there was kind of a ridge or something, I did kind of hit it just to kind of establish some highlights with the reflections. But basically, if it was highlights, I hit it with a dry brush. If it was not highlighted, I left it alone. Once that dried, I went back and to each of those colors, each of those paints, I added a little bit of white. I mixed it all in, and then I dry brushed again. But this time, instead of dry brushing the entire surface, I only dry brushed kind of part of the surface. And I made sure to focus on any edges. So like the armor, that pauldron that the Avatar has kind of those big edges. I made sure to hit it, so it's kind of like an edge highlight that way. And so you can kind of see a kind of a gradient of color. It's the same shade, but it goes from kind of dark to light. Now it's very subtle. It's not very striking, but it's there, and I like the way it looks. The only exception to this is with the mummy robe. So for the hair, I did do that with the dry brush, but the last bit of dry brush, I went in with just pure matte white, and I just very lightly kind of ran the brush over the hair, and it looks pretty good. I like the way it shows up on the model. And finally, I did do a very light dry brush of metallic silver over the weapon. So I painted those black, the flat black, not my usual gray. I wanted them to be very, very dark. And I just very lightly hit the edges and anything that was raised with this metallic silver. Actually, it was the gunmetal color, so it's the darker of the metallic silvers, just to kind of give it this sheen. And I think it looks really nice. Here is the Avatar, now that the dry brushing step is complete. And it's a subtle difference. I won't say it's a huge improvement, but I think close-up analysis, I think it adds a certain something to the model and the paint job. I particularly like the effect that it has on the hair. You can kind of see multiple colors on there, and the highlights exactly where they should be. I think it makes for a very dynamic kind of a paint job, I guess. And so with this step completed, the kind of preliminary, but I would argue probably the most important part of the model is done. The base coat set, the washes set, the model looks good. All we need to do now to make this officially tabletop ready is to add some of the details, and some of them are going to be easy, some of them a little less so. I'm going to spend more time than usual on the detailing on this model because there's a lot of little things to add that I think are going to be valuable. For most of the models that I use, I kind of pick and choose. I kind of gloss over a bunch of stuff, but this model, there's a lot of things to consider, and I think it's worthwhile to take a look at that stuff. So, probably the first thing I attempted was to fill in the kind of the cracks on the body of the Avatar and on his base as well. So my thought process was, he's a molten metal, molten stone kind of a being. So I wanted the model to reflect that, and so I filled in the kind of the cracks in his body with kind of a flame effect. And so that's kind of a detailed, labor-intensive process. So it involves a couple of steps. First, you have to fill in those gaps with white, a white undercoat, so that the colors that you lay on top of it can show up later on. Once all the cracks, and there's a lot of them, are filled in with the white undercoat, then I go back and hit them with kind of a dark red. I'm using Dragon Red from Army Painter. I'm using the glaze of this now. I'm mixing it with a good amount of flow improver and only a little bit of water. I don't want this to be transparent. I want it to flow really easily off the brush, but I don't want it to be transparent. I want it to be pretty bright. So that's how I mix that up. Once all the cracks have that red filled in, I go over that, repeat the process with a little bit of orange, kind of just a little bit less though. I still want the red to show up, so the orange is going to be a little bit more transparent, so it's going to have just a little bit more water. And I'm going to be a bit more selective on where I apply it. I'll do the same thing, even more selectively and even a little more thin with yellow. Kind of a bright yellow. The idea there is to show kind of a gradient from red to orange to yellow to show how kind of the fire is hotter in different places. Now your recipe for fire may differ. Use whatever recipe you feel most comfortable with, but if you're not quite sure how to do that, then I think mine will do the trick. I'm nearing the end of my work on this model, and it's coming together pretty nicely. This stage of the detailing process is basically just picking out those few little things that aren't covered by the rest of the model. Specifically, I'm speaking about the emblems. So the Avatar has little emblems kind of on leather belts all over his body. These correspond, I think, to each of the aspects that the Avatar essentially is, well, not in control over, but inspires kind of the various dimensions of combat that the Avatar, that the Eldar kind of specialize in. So each of these is undercoated in matte black. I use a heavy glaze for these because I want these to be pretty dark because black isn't going to be their overall color. That's going to be metallic silver. In this case, probably a darker version of that, so like a gunmetal or something to that effect. And so once the undercoat is dry, we'll go over that with that metallic paint. And also all of the leather belts to which these emblems are attached to, they get an undercoat of white. Now they began life as white, but along the way they got a little bit of stuff on them from all the other paint that happened around them. So I gave them an undercoat of white just to make sure that when that dries and I go back over it with like a leather brown, that the brown will register. And so I focused on kind of the outside and the top parts of the belt. The bottom parts of the belt, I left them kind of in shadow so that when the leather goes on there, it will be appropriately dark where the light doesn't hit. That's also a good place to talk about the bloody-handed gauntlet. And so for this, I'm going to use a crimson blood. It's an effects paint from Army Painter. It's been doubling as my dark red for other projects, but for this case, I wanted to use, for its intended purpose, surprise, surprise, of acting as paint for blood. Before this paint goes on, I have a little bit of glazing work of just some dark. Well, it's some black paint. It's a very light glaze of black paint, kind of on the parts where the blood will be kind of in shadow, just so that it's not monolithically this red thing. I want it to have a little bit of something, kind of a little bit of shadows that are happening to the blood parts. There's a few other things, and there's one more section that I want to talk about, but I'll pick that up because well, it's overbrushing, and it's not something I talk about too much in detail, but I kind of want to show you how that works because there's a lot of opportunities to engage in overbrushing on this model, so I thought this is a good place to showcase that skill. Overbrushing is a neat technique. It is a good ratio of skill to results. In other words, you don't have to have a ton of skill to have outsized impact results on your model. Essentially, it's kind of a cross between edge highlighting and dry brushing. So you take a brush, in this case I'm using a very small, a relatively small brush, and I'm adding a bit of paint to the brush, not a ton. I just want to kind of lightly touch the paint to the brush. In this case I'm using gunmetal from Army Painter to add the little filigree details. And the idea here is to just gently rub the raised details with this metallic silver paint. And as you rub these details, some of that paint gets deposited onto those raised surfaces without impacting the surface that it's raised away from. That's usually very, very close to this raised detail, but not, it's just enough away that you can pull this off. It's a lot like dry brushing because you're using a very light touch and you're using a relatively dry paintbrush, although it's not as dry as your paintbrush has to be for a good dry brushing. For that, you have to dry your brush quite a bit. Here, because you're just using a very light touch, you don't have to do that. And the reason I say it's similar to edge highlighting is because you're not really touching the tip of the brush to the raised surface. You're actually touching the edge of the brush, and that gives you a bit more control over how the paint that you're overbrushing is deposited on that filigreed surface. One of the nice things about something like that is that the details are typically small scale. At least on the Avatar here, they are pretty small scale. So you don't have to be perfect since the metallic paint that I'm using is meant to really just catch the eye and to suggest reflection if a surface kind of goes around a model, in this case like the hafts of the weapons. Some of those filigree details are kind of on one surface, but some of them wrap around the weapon. You don't have to hit the entire thing because sunlight or the area lighting won't reflect equally from all surfaces of even this metallic surface. So, hitting the primary areas without hitting every single one of them, or to do so kind of lightly, right, where the paint is deposited a little bit more in some areas and a little bit less, that kind of tricks the eye into seeing a sparkle and to interpreting it as the sunlight is reflecting off the surface differently. In reality, it's just you're focusing on the areas that are going to be most visible, and you're reducing the complexity of the task by not having to hit all those hard-to-reach areas. So, yeah, it's a powerful technique. It gives you a lot of bang for your buck. Well, all the detailing is done. There was mercifully relatively few Aeldar gems. So here he is. My Avatar of Khaine. He's all done, and he looks pretty spiffy if you ask me. Is it the best paint job I could have done? No. But it is probably the best paint job I have done. There was a couple of decisions I made that maybe cost me a little bit in quality. I can see a touch up here that I've missed. But overall, I think he's a pretty cool looking model. So here are some of the things that I learned as I completed this project. One is to not be afraid of blending. It's tough to see on this model because I did do some blending on glazing. So blending by glazing. In other words, achieving the transition of color from one hue to the other using glazing as opposed to blending, which I'm still pretty crappy at. Although, to do a good job of blending, you also need an element of glazing because you glaze in between the color hues to kind of ease the transition between them. So they're kind of similar, but I didn't really do any of that. I mostly stuck with glazing. In other words, having a very, very dilute hue of one color kind of glazed over another hue, or a hue of a different color. I don't know how that works. And this is most notable in the flames right here, and like on the armor, you can see the transition from kind of a dark red, goes through an orange, and it ends up in a yellow, and they're in kind of different spots on the flame, and I think that looks pretty good. The base, not so much. I attempted to create like a magma or a lava base, and I mean, you can kind of see what I was going for, but I'm not happy with my painting on the actual lava effects. I used some glazing transitions, and I mean, they achieved what they did, but I don't think I captured the effect. I probably need to do some lines or whatever. It's okay. Lesson learned. Also, on the base, the lack of foliage kind of makes it look barren, even though I did spend quite a bit of time on it. So there is that. Adding a few tufts of grass, it makes an effort. So what kind of decisions did I make that made this less than the best possible job of painting that I could do? Well, there's a couple. For one, if you look at the shoulder pads, you can kind of tell there was some glazing, the transitioning from highlighted blue at the very top to darker blues at the very bottom. The underside, those are sufficiently shadowed. I think I did a decent job there. But I was fairly timid with my glazing, basically the highlights. And so as a result, they're really almost too subtle. I've seen some really amazing highlights achieved with either blending or glazing, and I didn't get that here. But you know what? I'm really at my initial stages of learning that glazing technique to transition. So I think it's fine, but I certainly could have done a better job. So I said earlier that there wasn't a ton of Eldar gems on this model, and there weren't relative to other models that I've painted. But those that were here, I went ahead and I kind of branched out a little bit, and I used a couple of different colors, which I do like. I do like my use of a color here. But you'll notice so I did attempt to do that little, I think it's called a specular highlight or a specular effect on the jewels, basically showing the reflection of light coming from the top, and so it leaves a kind of a light spot on the top of the gem, and then the bottom is kind of a little bit shadowed. So I did attempt that. Sometimes they look better than others, but that isn't something that I've attempted a ton of in the past, so I'm going to give myself I'm going to cut myself a little bit of slack. I tried it, and it worked pretty well, but my technique absolutely needs a lot of work. So I've swapped out the head and the arm that I've magnetized on there, because sometimes I want an axe, sometimes I want a sword, sometimes I want a big old spear. And so, yeah, I did that, so that wasn't part of this, but one of the other things that I've learned, and this has less to do with painting and more to do with the assembly, or the assembly process. You'll notice here that these belts don't quite connect with the armor plate that's in front of the Avatar. And I suspect it's because I didn't attach the pieces in the right spots. It's kind of a tricky build in some cases, and so I wasn't exactly sure, because these belts are its own separate piece. So each belt is a couple of different pieces, and you attach it to the model kind of with the tiniest little bits of contact, and you're never really sure, at least I wasn't really sure, where they really were supposed to go. And if you deviate from where they're absolutely supposed to go, you end up with something like this. I'm almost positive, I'm going to go like 98% positive, that this was not warping of the plastic. The kit is a gorgeous, well-made, high-quality kit. So I'm not going to blame this on the molding. This is my deal. And so if I wanted to do an absolutely perfect job, I'd break these off and reattach them where they're supposed to go. But I'm not confident that if I break them off, I'm not going to make matters worse. So I'm just going to take my lumps, and it's going to be slightly disconnected. We'll call it Eldar magic. That's how they're attached. I have a similar issue. You'll notice this, I think it's called a greave. Maybe that's a bracer. I'm not entirely sure. It's this arm armor. You'll notice how it's disconnected from the other arm. There's this big old gap here, and that's because when I went to magnetize the arm, I should have gone deeper with this magnet, and I still have the opportunity to do so. So if you want to be able to swap the arms, you kind of have to do this. You have to magnetize the, I'm going to call it the bracer as well, because you only get one bracer and you get 3 different arms, so you have to magnetize it, but you should probably do a better job than I did here. There's quite a bit of material underneath this bracer that interferes with the placement of the bracer when you mount it on any of the arms, and so you end up looking like that. Now, it's not horrible, but I could have done a better job. And maybe not finally, but one of the other things that I should point out is, while this tabard, this loincloth, looks better than my typical efforts at this, I'm not confident. I still need a lot of work with fabrics like this. The backside is sufficiently in shadow. I think that's fine, but I could have done a better job here. You'll notice a little bit of blue peeking out in the shadow areas. That was kind of by intent, not necessarily. They didn't end up exactly where I wanted them, but you know what? I'm still learning how to do this, so I'm going to give myself a break. I could have also done some hatch work, like provide some kind of texture to this, adding some fine lines. I've seen some really cool videos on how that's accomplished to make it look good. I don't think my painting skills are there yet. I may be a couple of years away from being able to accomplish something like that and make it look good on the model, as opposed to detracting from the overall paint quality of the model. So you know what, I'm going to be satisfied with this and do better in other projects. I could have also applied kind of a decal, that slide, the transfer sheet thing. The Aeldar model did not come with that, but I could get some, I could create some, or I could just freehand something. And if I don't feel confident enough to add some fabric hatch marks on this loincloth, there's no way I'm feeling confident enough to add a free-handed Eldar symbol. Swapping my magnetized parts yet again. I guess the final commentary is on the color selection. I wanted to tie this model, this Aeldar Avatar, I wanted to tie it to the craft world that I chose, and the color palette for my craft world is this yellow, this muted yellow, and this kind of dark blue. And I think it's fine, but I don't know if it fits well with this model. I don't know. It looks a little cartoony to me. There's a lot of colors happening here. I do like the effect, the stone, this gray effect with the kind of filled in like lava, I guess panel lines, those recesses. I think I managed to convey lava-ness, molten-ness in those cracks sufficiently well. But yeah, overall, I'm not sure about my color palette, or at least the extent to which I use the yellows and blues. I think maybe I could have gone with less yellow and less blue and have overall the model be darker with just the yellows and blues being accent colors. I don't know. I haven't kind of settled on my use of color there. So, you know what, that's it. I'm pretty happy with it. I think I've done a pretty good job, and I hope that you've gained a bit of confidence after watching this video and tackling your own Avatar of Khaine model. It's a stupendous model. There's lots of detail. It doesn't have to be hard, but it can be hard if you make it, if you challenge yourself. So it provides a lot of flexibility. If you don't, try hard, it's still going to look pretty good. If you try hard, it might look even better. But yeah, this is a worthy addition to any Eldar army, or just anyone who really likes the look of this model. Put it on a plinth, put it in a case, and admire your work. And before I close this video, I think I would be remiss if I didn't show both of my beautiful Eldar models. Well, one beautiful Eldar model and one an attempt was made model. This was painted more than 20 years ago at this point, before I acquired all the skills that YouTube and about 1.5 years of practice have lent me. There's quite a bit of difference between them, but I just love the scale creep. I don't know. This is a cool project. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your eyeballs. If you learned something, give this video a like. If you think someone else might learn from something like this, give it a share. That would be awesome too. Maybe even a subscribe. I'd appreciate it. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.